Toshia.
Hey, hello, my name is Toshia. I'll be paneling this round. I don't have particular preference for gender pronoun. Good luck to both teams. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zach. I have no preference as to how you address me. Best of luck.
Okay, thank you. Can I just confirm, is Shruti here? Shruti there?
Am I not audible?
Oh, yeah, you're audible now.
My bad. Hi, everyone. Shritishi or they pronouns. Good luck for the round.
All right, and that is the panel. So some house rules. Make sure you tell your opponents how you want to take your POIs. I will do my best to time, but you should time yourself as well, just in case things happen. And without further ado, on the motion that this House believes that it is a legitimate tactic for activists to launch campaigns of personal attacks, insults at the family members of corrupt politicians. Prime Minister, the floor is all yours. You're here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, starting in a moment. POIs verbally, please. I'm not gonna look at the chat. We think family members of corrupt politicians are in a unique position to have sway on the way these politicians act, and we also believe that these family members are often direct recipients or beneficiaries of this corruption, in the sense that they get, through nepotism, they get positions on like prestigious company boards, they get access to like prestigious universities for free or for no cost. They often get like just lavish properties in like expensive neighborhoods and whatnot. We think they are directly responsible, and we think they're in a unique position to be able to call these people out, and therefore we think that they should do so, and therefore we think it's a legitimate tactic. So first, a bit on the framing. So like, what do we mean when we say it's legitimate? What does it actually mean? So we think that first, what it doesn't mean. We don't think it means that we need to prove that this kind of call outs of family members is always the most effective tactic, nor that it will always be used. We think that for it to be legitimate, we need to prove first that there are situations when this is first justified, and secondly that it can situations where it's extremely effective. We think these are things that we're looking for. We don't have to defend a blanket policy of always using this for every single individual out there. So what does this actually look like? We think this looks like activists going on SNS and like publicizing or like spreading reports, for example, of someone's daughter getting into an exclusive grad school on like very fishy grounds, or for example, there might be a whistleblower from like a company that says that, hey, actually this famous like son of a politician didn't actually deserve this promotion. They're on this position for no reason. We think once these kinds of allegations rise, we can often boost their visibility by spreading them on SNS, or for example, contacting news agencies and whatnot to get them to publicize and get them to like spread this information. I think these are things we're looking for. So there's two parts to my case here. First is on the justification, and second is on the effectiveness. Very simple. So first on the justification, we think that the reason this is justified, we think, because if you think about the context when these tactics are used, we think the context when these kind of call outs of family members are used is often cases where reports of families getting, for example, like nepotistic promotions or like access to grad schools, or for example, getting like lavish or like properties and gifts from their like fathers or like relatives, even though oftentimes when these politicians like funds or like incomes are publicly publicized in many countries, it doesn't really match up how they have all these like amazing like billions of dollars to have all these amazing, for example, properties or like whatnot. We think once these kind of reports rise or whistleblowers like come out, I think this is when oftentimes these activists grab onto these stories or narratives and start spreading them. So oftentimes this is to say that activists often have reasonable basis to know that the family is complicit or that the family is directly benefiting from and that there is corruption happening. We think the reason why we think that this won't be used to like unjustly just trash talk everyone's families is for a couple of reasons. First, we don't think activists are like dumb. We don't think activists will often have like some sort of political goal, some sort of like political objective that they're going for, and therefore inherently they want to gain popular support and they want to get others to support them. We think therefore activists probably aren't just gonna like go out and call out everyone for like any kind of tiny potential of like corruption. We think oftentimes activists rally when there is news of like families benefiting unfairly. For example, a recent famous case in Korea where Minister of Justice was like where there was like a scandal of like their daughter getting like into a top university, you know, on like very fishy grounds. We think often when these kind of reports come out, that's when activists usually mobilize. Secondly, we think they won't unjustly use it because attacking a politician for no reason makes you look really bad. Like it makes you look like really unpopular, and therefore it goes against what you want as an activist who has a political goal. So therefore, why is the family responsible? We think the family members are responsible because oftentimes corruption benefits directly go to the family. I already gave you plenty of examples. And we think that as a family member, you are the closest one. You're probably one of the closest people to this politician, probably a daughter or a mother of them or like something like this. So you probably know about it for sure. You're for sure aware of like where this, for example, money is coming to your family, right? Because you have the most close information about this politician. Therefore, we think that either you're negligent in the sense that you're not like trying to call them out or trying to stop them from doing this, or B, you're actively supporting it and actively embracing getting benefits from, you know, usually tax money from the people of your country, right? Which is clearly unfair, right? We think because you're closer to this person, you share personal ties, you probably love them as a family member, you're in the best position to influence them and to stop them from like committing these acts. And therefore, we think you have the responsibility to do so, kind of like a good Samaritan law, where like if you're in a position to like stop horrible things from happening, we think you have a responsibility to do so, especially if you've benefited from yourself. But then Up might say, oh, but what if they try to change their minds? What if they try to influence a politician, but it didn't work? What if they tried their best, but activists still call them out? What then happens? We think even in this case, families always have the option to turn them in. For example, to come out with like evidence or like come out and like give their personal stories of like how the family member has like been corrupt, or they can just, you know, divorce from this like politician, or they can distance themselves from this politician by like, you know, cutting ties with them. We think always there are ways for you to like distance yourself from this corruption and stop benefiting from them. Therefore, if you don't do so, we think you are responsible, and therefore we think that it's a legitimate strategy. Second, the effectiveness of this. We think calling out these politicians is an extremely effective strategy. I mean, not the politician's family, because politicians themselves are often extremely jaded and hardened by the nature of like politics. And we therefore think that they won't be affected by the call outs as much. So we think that politicians always face hatred due to the inherent divisive nature of like politics, where like clearly people are very passionate about it and people like fight wars over it and whatnot. Therefore, we think that they're probably used to like getting like shit on their like neck from like having controversial opinions or whatnot. B, we think that politicians often are usually people, or becoming a politician usually selects for people who are good with confrontation. For example, people who like debate, people who are very good with confrontation and very not afraid of like publicly expressing their opinions. Therefore, we think that the counter model that might suggest of just calling out the politician probably won't work. The politicians aren't that easily embarrassed, aren't that easily feeling like they need to change their actions, right? However, that's not the same for the family. The family is much more likely to be affected by the callouts because if you think about it, as a family member, you're someone who's probably not into politics. For most people aren't. Therefore, you don't think you're used to having people, for example, whisper about you on the street when you walk there, which often makes people like hugely anxious. And oftentimes, this is the first time that a family member gets into the news because this is such a big scandal, right? We think therefore you're not used to people whispering about you on the street. You're not used to feeling like everyone is your enemy. You're not used to feeling like everyone is doubting you and nobody might trust you. Even when you talk with your friends or acquaintances, you think in your mind that what if these people now also hate me? We think you become crippled due to anxiety and become unable to live your life in a fulfilling way. Therefore, you have massive incentive to influence this politician and to call them out. We think you're able to change your mind because you're close to them, probably a long history with them. You can appeal to them by sharing your hardships that have come from their actions and from the activist call-outs. I mean, therefore, you can stop corruption from the inside by affecting politicians, also from the outside by creating a cascading effect where activists come out and call these families in a more clear manner. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Hello, please.
So, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Well, okay. So, give me a second to set up my timer. My time starts in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we support a world where social activists do not risk their life and do not risk their cause at the expense of their own lives. I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. First, I'm going to talk about the principal justification of the taxes and why it is problematic and illegitimate for social activists to do. And second, I'm going to directly engage on their side about why it is going to be less effective for you to deter corruption from happening. But before that, just one rebuttal against the previous speaker. The previous speaker said, like, their model is like, we are going to act as social activists, going to like just spread newspapers and just like do the pamphlets, and we are not going to use it always, right? For example, like, firstly, I'm just think that firstly, it is simply soft on their side of the house. They simply like take a soft stance. I will not always do this, right? And second of all, we think that they ignore the context nuances in this debate, right? We think this debate happens in corruption rampant areas where you have seen a lot of corrupted officials. This is because, like, firstly, you necessarily do not have the political and the legal accountability system to begin with. That is why a lot of times you do not, as social activists, cannot use like through the like legal ways to like co-opt the legal to deter corruption. That is why on their side of the house, they have to defend like using these like tactics in the majority of their cases to deal with the corruption, right? Coming to our stance is clear. We support several things, right? Firstly, we support like publicly call out bad politicians and call out their corruption their corruption. Second, we're going to call out for like harsher judicial investigation into these corruption issues, right? And lastly, we also like call out for a much more transparent voting election system by campaigning or whatsoever. So we think it is illegitimate for us to, as a social activist, to conduct this personal attack and insults towards our family members. First, on principal justification, why we think it is principally problematic. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, we think that harming the innocent is principally problematic. There are several reasons for this, right? Firstly, you know here, we think family members are innocent. This is for several reasons, right? Firstly, we think family members, in a lot of times, they do not even know the existence of corruption, right? They have no awareness of the corruption of their like husband or whatsoever, right? This, for example, right? The husband may, the corrupted officials may like feel ashamed to talk like about his corrupted behavior in front of family members, right? And second, but more important is that a lot of times those politicians like simply conceal the fact that they corrupted and use the deception, for example, by setting up trustees, by setting up like foundations, like in a broad overseas account, for example, in the Swiss bank, right, to like secretly support their families like spending, right? And second, right, even if somehow the family members are aware of this like corruption problem, they themselves are not participate in this corruption. Why this case? Because a lot of times we think this, they know absolutely that it is very risky to be corrupted in the first place, because if you are corrupted politicians, firstly, you obey the very like promise that you have made to your own people. This is morally shameful, and more importantly is that you risk losing your life. That is why we think presumably a lot of the family members do not support their like corrupted spouses, right? And the third reason why those family members are innocent, right? Even if we say at the side of the house, those members, they do get benefits and they do know the existence of corruption, it is because they have no agency in changing the decision-making mechanisms of those corrupted officials, right? This is because a lot of times there is a power disparity within the family like relationship. For example, a lot of times those like corrupted officials are the financial pillar of this entire family, right? It means that like probably his wife, his children depend on financial like resources. That is why a lot of times, even if they know that, they cannot simply challenge the legitimacy or the correctness of the action. And lastly is because the fact of kinship and the family members based on the blood, based on the arbitrary fact that you are born into a family. That is why you cannot opt out. That is why a lot of times people simply have to accept that. That is why they are innocent. Second, we think it is principally problematic because it's against the procedural justice or fairness of the legality that we support. We think it's important, right? The first thing to note here that social activists is a unique actor that values like social justice, that values the legality and judicial fairness. Why is the case? Because a lot of this is for two reasons. First is because the social activist has a unique principle and value that uphold human rights and morality, human rights and democracy. That is why it has to follow the rules of judicial system. system. And secondly, more importantly, because the behavior, the way that they can mobilize for change through the entire system, for example, asking for more individual rights protection is through the legal system, through the judicial branch. That is why you have to to obey the procedural justice. The way the gov side proposes as this actually conducts a actual judicial violence against the people who are innocent. That is why it against the fundamental principle of democracy, the fundamental principle of legality that social activists themselves have to propose and have to support in this debate, right? So coming to my second constructive, why we think it is actually less effective on their side of the house is to deter corruption. The first thing to note here is that a lot of times social activists, they lack the political capital and the public support. This is for two reasons. Firstly, is because in a lot of the countries where the corruption is rampant, there's generally like developing countries and poor nations which you do not have a free media that it can freely yell out and disclose the corruption problem by the corrupted officials, right? And there's media manipulation by the central government. And second, because a lot of times the central government has so much strong a police power that it can arrest those social activists and put them into prison. That is why it is less likely for them to succeed for the social activists. The conclusion of this is that social activists already feel a high risk of jail and attack from the corrupt officials, right? However, the mechanism on this side of the house is going to get worse because two mechanisms. Firstly, within the government policy will only give justification to suppress the social activists and arrest them. Why is the case? Because to the degree that they have concrete evidence of you as a social activist, personally attack them on street, personally insulting them online, that is the moment they can correct concrete evidence they show to the public and to prove how you guys are violating the laws that we all in high society view as legitimate. And the second mechanism is that a lot of times you lose the political capital on the side of the house because the corrupted officials simply going to frame those social activists in the media as an attacker that conduct violence. They're going to blame those people as someone who disturbed the social order, who harm the innocent, and that is why you're going to lose the public support. You're going to lose the credibility. Ultimately, why it is important? We think two things. Firstly, you as a social activist, you are facing a high risk of safety. For example, you may get to be thrown out in the prison, right? This means less social activists might able to come out, right? Second, more importantly, you lose the credibility for advocate of your campaign, of your slogan. That is why people tend to less trust in you, people less to buy into your political slogan, and that is why we're very proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you. DPM, please.
Hi, assuming I'm audible.
Yeah, you are.
Thanks. Side opposition cannot say that they will magically increase transparency out of nowhere, right? When they don't really prove to you where that impetus to improve the transparency of these corrupt regimes comes from, we don't think that they can automatically assume that the activism will suddenly be able to achieve transparency, suddenly be able to achieve all of these media scrutinies and other checks and balances mechanism, right? Because when leader of opposition talks about how these regimes are going to put activists into jail, these things happen already, and these are the contexts that we're talking about, right? Because when you look at, for instance, Russia and how Putin literally, tried to kill Navalny, it wasn't because Navalny was attacking family. It was precisely based on the sheer fact that these people are activists, right? So I don't really think that opposition side can assert that these activists will put into significantly more extent of danger on our side of the bench just because they attack these family members, personally speaking, right? We don't think that they can argue that because the reason as to why these corrupt politicians put these individuals into jail or incarcerate them is sheer fact that these people are activists. So we don't think that that is a very significant delta of this debate anyways, right? The principal material that came from speaker before me is that activists need to abide by the judicial systems and legal mechanisms, right? I don't think that this is something that is really true, or I don't think that this is a very important clash in this debate, because we're not punching these people into their faces, or we're not killing these family members, right? We're personally insulting them, which means that we defame them or whatnot. We call them axis of evil. We call them also a contributor of the corrupt systems. I'm not entirely sure as to why suddenly just because you personally insult them does automatically means that we're doing things that are illegal. I don't think that this is true. And to be fair, in corrupt regime, activism itself is already illegal, so I don't think that the legality should be the main question of this debate. Two things I'm going to bring in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about some principle material. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the effectiveness. Firstly, on the idea of principle, right? Firstly, we think that you know when you are family, what your family members are doing, right? You know that the corruption are existing, right? If LO talks about the corrupt regime that literally puts activists into jail, you as a family member have recognition of what your family members are doing and the corruption that is happening. Precisely if it is true that activists are already calling out these politicians, you as an individual family member have certain extent of knowledge and recognition that these structural failures are existing, right? We also tell you that there are mechanisms through which these family members can counterbalance the corruption that is existing, right? Maybe you cannot fully stop them, but you can report these things to media. You can report these things to activists. You can report these things to police officers and whatnot. But the very fact that you are staying silent is it's not justified precisely based on the fact that, number one, you knew that the corruption was happening. Number two, there were things that you could have done, but the fact that you chose to stay silent in itself is already illegitimate to the extent to which this insult and blaming these individuals is something that's justified. Secondly, oftentimes the incentive to be corrupt comes from family, right? Incentive to leave legacy, let them enter privileged universities and etc. by patronage, nepotism, whatnot. One of the causes of corruption is family, and therefore these things need to be addressed. Something that Mika told you that the previous speaker wasn't able to respond to. Lastly, these family members are also the beneficiary of corruption, right? That's why LO's argument of how these politicians are concealing all of the things that happen isn't true, right? Because oftentimes these kids are the ones that enter to prestigious university based on their corrupt family members, right? So to a degree, you know that corruption is happening, right? But I also think that therefore these people use their capital to entrench their benefit, entrench their privilege, and therefore it's fair for us to say that these people are directly involved in the injustices. Just like how we also personally attack the fellow politicians or fellow corrupt other people, I think that it's still fair for us to say that insofar as because you were directly involved, the justification for us to personally insult still stands in this debate. And therefore hierarchy doesn't make sense because hierarchy doesn't matter. We also criticize other forms of politicians, even if they were bureaucratically on a lower rank, right? So I don't really think that this is an important thing. If this family is already doing something to stop corruption, like what Nika said, strategically speaking, movement would not criticize because they are already inside the movement and these family members are our ally. But precisely in cases in which these things don't happen, which is the majority of the case, we think that justification to insult them personally still stands. And that's why principally we should pass this motion. Before moving on to pragmatics, I'll take POI.
Given that in a lot of conservative countries, there's likely to be a family power in structure, and there's a lot of stigmatization on divorce, and a lot of women are hard to find jobs they do divorce. How are they having no cause to call their husbands out or sending them in?
That doesn't matter because even in political parties, there's hierarchy among politicians. And just because you are in a lower rank, bureaucratically lower rank politician, doesn't mean that society or movement cannot criticize them. Insofar as you're directly involved, insofar as you have some contribution to the corruption, you as a social movement have the moral legitimacy or legitimate ground to criticize them. Secondly, why do we think that effectiveness happens on our side of the bench? And here's where I want to engage with Elo's argument about how politicians entrench their power. I'm going to show you why this is likely to change. Firstly, on an individual level, like what Mika said, politicians are already immune to criticism, therefore they can easily brush off the call-outs. Look at Trump, who don't really give anything, right? Firstly, we push these families to take actions because what our message necessarily entails is that you can do something and you should do something. We give agency to these families and therefore we incentivize them to stop or at least mitigate the extent of corruption that exists. Secondly, even when it comes to these politicians, when they see their family members being attacked, this serves as an incentive to be less corrupt because under opposition, politicians are likely to easily think that I can do these corrupt activities precisely because this is just my own personal domain that these social movements don't have the ability to infiltrate. I think that the very fact that social activism is also being a watchdog of the personal domain of these politicians is a huge incentive for these individuals to want to not be corrupt. But secondly, I think that we mobilize the society through catharsis. Firstly, I think that oftentimes politicians are seen as intellectuals, seen as authorities, seen as elites in the society, and therefore calling these individuals out has a like entry barrier and threshold, right? However, when it comes to families, it is relatively easier to call them out because there's less entry barrier because families are not seen as equally intelligent and elite, right? Which means that in the perspective of general public, it is easier to call out the family. And therefore, if we focus on family members, we're able to gain that critical mass compared to opposition side in which like the intellectual, like the entire hierarchy of these politicians are going to function as a deterrence mechanism for the society to call out. But secondly, I think that we're able to address bigger picture because now that we're able to criticize the entire structure and how these structures are shaped in a way in which these people are able to retain the personal benefit allows for the society to recognize that these things exist, and that serves as an impetus for the society to change the structure. That's where transparency comes from that opposition side did not prove in their speech.
All right, thank you very much. The yellow, please.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me time myself. So my time will start in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the principle. Why do we think that at our side house, there's no principle justification for you to actually call them out? Secondly, I'm going to talk about why at our side house is going to be more effective, even if at the cost that in the short term probably are going to be effective, right? But I think that the main problem with the government side is that there's almost zero mechanism coming from how it's going to be effective, right? The only mechanism coming from government to say it is in fact effective is to say a lot of time the kind of like the relatives are not trained well enough. They're just normal people, not the kind of intellectuals and whatsoever, right? This is probably not true in several ways, right? Number one, we already talk about if it is true that the politicians actually value them too much, we think that a lot of time they will actually use their political capitals or use their social capital, for instance, to transfer their families to like overseas or to protect them at the very first instance, right? But secondly, we think a lot of time these like family groups of members, because oftentimes they're still under the kind of like media exposure, because all the kind of like behavior will be actually noticed. So we think that they're going to be trained in a way that actually can be better performance like in front of the media at the very first instance. So all the kind of mechanism does not actually work at their side house to prove why it is effective at all, right? But secondly, I want to engage more with the kind of like principle, right? Several principles we talk about. Number one, we think that it's just procedurally unjust when we try to use social media and like try to convict someone at the very first instance, right? But secondly, I think that they're not just actively make that decision at the very first place. They're not actually being capable for actually making all these decisions. But thirdly, I want to know, it's very important for them to actually opt out or to like call out as call the kind of like politicians out as the government try to depict, right? Why is that the case? Number one, I think that a lot of times you need to consider the context in this debate, right? We think that this context is more likely to happen in the developing world, especially because in the developed world, you have so many mechanisms. You have like a media pressure, media like coverage. You have like a lot of like more developed like institutions for to actually to supervise on the corruption at the very first instance, right? There's no need for you to actually use that strategy for you to actually become successful for calling out, right? What does it actually mean? It means that a lot of times it is more likely for the whole society that be in this debate to hold a kind of like conservative idea at the very first instance. For instance, a lot of times the kind of politicians are more likely to be male, or more likely to be like powerful in the kind of like family and whatsoever, right? What does it actually mean, right? It means that there's going to be a huge cost when the kind of like family members are trying to call them out, right? It look like firstly, it's hard for you to opt out. For instance, if you are daughters, if you are actually your kids, a lot of time it's hard for you to actually opt out, especially because like you already have certain kind of like blood connected with them at the very first instance. But secondly, you're facing a lot of like stigmatization when you actually try to call them out or try to cut off all the kind of like connections with them, right? That is a moment, for instance, like women are oftentimes be considered as a kind of stigmatization when they actually choose to divorce and whatsoever, right? But secondly, I think that a lot of times it's like just less job opportunities for women, especially when you choose to actually divorce, there's less opportunity. Oftentimes male are the only one that actually to some degree support the families. There's a huge cost for them to actually opt out, to choose to divorce and whatsoever, right? It also applies to the kids when a lot of times the kids are actually facing a lot of stigmatization when they actually do not have the kind of like the parents at the very first instance, right? which all this together means that the kind of like proving to say a lot of time they can actually choose to actually call them out is not actually stand at the very first place. But more importantly, I think that a lot of times it's just not proportionate at the very first instance, right? I think that firstly, I want to characterize what it actually look like for you to actually have this kind of like personal insult like online, right? It looks like things like, you oftentimes have like groundless conjecture, because oftentimes notice that the public is not going to be rational, right? They're not going to look at every evidence that you actually provide and whatsoever. They're more likely to some degree follow the trend, right? And when they actually fall into certain kind of bias at the very first instance, right, it's hard for them to actually correct them, even if they find it's not the case, right? So we think that there's going to be groundless conjecture or the kind of like a lot of like harassment on you at the very first instance, right? It's not just applied to social media; it also applies to the real life, right? You are actually look like things that will actually break the window, or like affect all the behavior if you are kids at school, and all you probably are facing a lot of like bullying or teasing you at the very first instance. It causes like immense harm to individuals mentally and physically at the very first instance, right? So even if we believe that there's going to be some kind of like responsibility in their inaction to like call the kind of politicians out, the proportionality does not actually stand, because you're causing a kind of disproportionate harm to these individuals at the very first place, right? But secondly, I want to talk about what are the counterfactual, or what are the kind of like policies at our side house. We think we're going to mainly argue for the institutional changes, or like judicial system to actually change, or change the kind of like voting system at the very first instance, right? The first thing to note here is that we think that at our side house, firstly, I think that just like the political capital is quite mutually inclusive, right? You only have limited resources to cope with like kind of like corruption at the very first instance. But secondly, we also think that there's to some degree that people's pressure also exists at our side house, especially when you consider about we are talking about how are you going to solve all these things when the exposure already happened, right? So we think that we're still going to have people's pressure, like because it's directly related to their own lives, directly related to the taxpayers' money and whatsoever. There's going to be people's pressure at our side house, right? So the second thing to note here, why do we think that at our side house it's going to be comparatively better, even we can admit that in the short run it might be more effective at their side house? But before that, I will take point.
Yeah, we're not asking them to get divorced or leave your family. The message is that you should also try to change and curb that behavior, and therefore stigmatization isn't really a delta anyways.
Firstly, I don't know how you're going to let them just like criticize them, and I don't know how it will actually work when you actually, I think that divorce or whatsoever actually happened on your PM speech as well, right? So I think that there's no delta for you to actually just simply criticize. I already talk about the framing, that how it's going to be ineffective in the kind of a power structure existing, right? Why at our side of the house we're willing to actually trade off the short-term benefits, even if they to some degree prove that, but there's no proving at all, right? The first thing to note here is that we think that personal attack is more likely to happen, right? You're more likely to have like irrational discussion, which is unhelpful for you to actually solve a lot of like institutional problems, right? Exactly because there's lack of supervision, exactly because like the judicial system is not being like developed enough. That is the moment why you are going to solve this, right? But secondly, we think that the solvency, even if that at their side of the house can be short run, it's going to be harmful in a way that it is more likely to be manipulated by the politicians in a way that, for example, to create certain kind of scandals, to use them as a political tool, because there's no developed agencies for you to actually like hold them accountable at the very first instance. It is more likely for the kind of politicians to use the media, to use a lot of like attention to say that it is to have this kind of personal attack, like when the kind of like the whole legal agencies is not going to be developed enough at their side of house, right? We think that the comparative at our side of house is that you get some examples at judicial system. It might not be that much, but I think that at our side of house, at least it can have some good examples that we would actually relate to, and at least you're getting some kind of changes at the kind of like judicial system. We think that's comparatively better at our side of house in the long run. Very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you. Gafwood, please.
Okay, I'll take my POIs verbally. I'm not looking at the chat, but sorry. Before moving on, I should shout out to HUFS Club members, my friends and families who've been supportive, my dad who supports my hobbies and dreams and who's watching this, and my girlfriend for cheering me up when I'm depressed. Thanks. I'll try to take POIs during the 5th minute if possible, maybe after my second flash. Okay. POIs again, verbally. Also, yeah, kudos to the opposition as well, making this far. Great, I'm gonna start my speech. 3, 2, 1. When team government says something is legitimate, we tell you it is a toolbox of tactics it can use. Social movements can specifically select individual cases because we're activists, right? But the backlash cases that the opposition talked about, we can mitigate, for example, by calculating political objectives and utilizing specific scenarios for degrees of control. If the case in the family in which a family isn't living with this politician or doesn't get the monies in which the politician supposedly has, whereas even if the politician is hoarding mass amounts of money, but they don't actually use it for the public their gains of the families, I'm not sure as to why the activists would actually do so. But opposition then says like, oh, this is a soft stance, so therefore it's wrong. If I say it is legitimate to use a knife for cooking lunch, doesn't mean I have to always use using it as a frying pan, right? I just don't think trying to use tools in a selective way is a soft stance. We must say opposition. We can say government is doing a bad job, right? Opposition also says that public will be always irrational. We told you you're an activist in the motion, therefore we have some level of control on the outcomes. But B, I'm unsure as if other mechanisms of calling out won't be proportionate, right? Notice that hatred, if that would go to the family, if related and sent to the politician, then instead will be rational or proportionate. No calculation in this whatsoever, right? Just because people are emotional to their families doesn't mean that they'll be emotional more towards the politicians, and therefore all the harms that accrue of irrationality and social movements, right? I don't think that's a point of debate. Three clashes. First, mobilize social change. Secondly, principle. Third, so how to change within family structures, right? First of all, principle. First of all, mobilizing social movements. Even if the family does not change, in the opposition's, I think, probably weakest flaws, I don't think that this means that the government currently speaking is doing a good job. The government currently may not be punishing these people, may not have the prosecutors look over problems because these people are relatively close, right? On government side, we told you a unique mechanism of opposition failed in these, right? We told you there is more autonomy and control over their actions because people have catharsis. We tell you if we distance the attack on the politician themselves to changing it to the families of the family members, people feel like it is more free to attack this individual, considering that politicians still have a significant amount of privileges, esteem, and intellectual capacity that is perceived. Therefore, people are more likely to also expand the discussion of what corruption looks like to also be engaged in the politics, right? The impact of this is that we are able to have people aware of the extent of corruption, but also we're able to ensure that you have much more numbers under our role. I think this is very important. First of all, opposition tells us that we have a risk of jail. If they're talking about the most conservative countries, I'm unsure, as DPM says, I'm unsure as to why attacking, for example, Putin is so difficult about attacking Putin and his daughter, right? It's just simply not a delta in this debate. But second of all, if you're talking about the most conservative societies, I think it is exactly that we need the people to ensure that we don't get everyone arrested. Because when you have humongous amount of people feel like they're in control of attacking a politician, you're likely to have a huge national discourse over, which means that it's more harder for a social movement to be shut down, right? Because everyone in the streets, everyone feels like it's easy to attack Putin's daughter rather than Putin. It's more likely that people will be more active and talk about their problems. Therefore, it's much more harder for you to, you're likely to face much more backlash for putting every single person to talk about their problems to jail. And exactly why we need to make this discussion more approachable for people in order to ensure that we don't get the movement to be shut down in the initial processes, right? That's the comparative we should talk about in this debate. So therefore, I just think that if you're worrying about getting people to jail, you got to have more people to ensure that you can't send everyone to jail, right? Second of all, principle. It's like also government told you that the people, the recipients of corruption are the ones who probably know the benefits, right? We told you things like, for example, you get things like better schools, you get better houses, you get better cars. Opposition says, but you can't simply report, you don't always know the fact of corruption. In that case, probably speaking, you probably don't get the direct beneficiaries of having a privileged, a corrupt life. That's the reason why probably speaking the public or the activists wouldn't criticize that person in the get-go, right? I just think we need to be calculative. But second of all, I would tell you that we tell you that you are, in some extent, you're acquiescing or neglecting and stopping and blocking this individual, right? You have a specific obligation because of specific circumstances. Oftentimes, families are most informed, right? Compared to people who are outside, the families who know the most, who are most exposed to degrees of corruption, relatively speaking, right? They also note, for example, that note the fact that oftentimes money is used for personal, private usages, which all people in the public don't have access to. See that you are oftentimes the most capable of making tangible change for things like, for example, moral persuasion, right? Things like the fact that you are very close to that person, right? Opposition says that people can't be blamed for arbitrary factors of being born. I did not choose to be born as a Korean male, but I still need to go to the military, right? Because I'm in the best position to serve the country because I'm Korean. I have a specific obligation that is unique, even though it's arbitrarily born in this area. I do have some obligation. And they say, but it's really hard for you because like Elo says, like maybe true family, like it's very unsure. Diallo says like it's unsure if you're like a divorced wife and it's going to be really hard for you to escape the system. We told you, it doesn't always have to be like complete exploring your family, but you can still do things like, for example, you can distance yourself. You can report to the police even if you don't persuade your family. But see, thought experiment. you're the only one that that knows your father is a serial killer, right? I probably should still do it if it's my father. Sorry, Dad. But corruption is equally a huge problem that decreases trust in politicians. It breeds inefficiency. Moreover, if the harm is so big, weighing that injustice to a corrupt system. Opposition says, the harms to individuals are big. We concede somewhat. That's the reason why they change their actions, right? Then we need to think about the harms in which we leave corruption. The harms is massive. We have thousands of people who are being starved to death because that money is not being used for social welfare, but being used so that a little rich kid can be happy. We think we would prefer to have one unhappy rich kid over thousands of people who are suffering day-to-day life because of corruption that we cannot solve right now, right? Before moving on, POI. 3, 2, 1, none. Okay. So going on. So Operation said a legality of justice. A legality of justice of social movements. I think, probably speaking, if social movements are implicit or not actively stopping, even if they have a great tool to solve corruption, that you would probably be also blamed for leaving the systematic injustices to be intact. So maybe sure, you get some backlash because you're not being proportionate to the rich people, but at the same time, you're not support. I think under opposition world, you're also being implicit and not helping out to solve the social problem. Therefore, backlash is going to happen either ways. I think that the degree of backlash people feel, the poor people who've been disenfranchised, will be greater under their world. Third of all, effectiveness, right? We told you a lot of mechanisms like psychological attacks on individuals will be more effective. No response whatsoever to this. Guido's rebuttals are funny because they said, because these people will use social capital to protect their families and send them overseas. That's exactly the point. Rich people don't want to go all the way overseas and be treated like they're third world. If the context is like third world developing countries, third world developing countries individuals who don't know their prestige, who don't have the money that they can use in these foreign areas. Therefore, these people will probably incentivize their loved ones to change their actions, right? All of these, even the operations mechanism of alternatives, show to the fact that it's very likely that the individual private lives of these politicians are likely to be accepted to change. We additionally told you as to why psychological attacks on politicians are very unlikely to change the incentive structure of these people. No explanation on operations is how to ensure that politicians make change. So even if we have the most corrupt system, which A, we cannot have social mobility in order to ensure that we have protests to have more government accountability. B, if we cannot persuade these individuals in a moral ground to change their actions, at least C, we're able to ensure because of the hatred, because their lives are so shit that they must make a change. They demand their husbands to give up on this to give up on signing a project. For all these reasons, we are so proud to propose.
Okay, thank you, Governor. Upward, please.
Hi, am I both visible and audible?
Yes, you're both of those things.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd take POI verbally, probably at 5 after I finish my second point. So yeah, and I will not receive POI before that. Yeah. And my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. We want to solve corruption and protect the rights of the people, but we want to solve it in an institutional, sustainable, and procedurally just way, which is through legal system, bringing down those corrupt officials, sending them to jail, or by democratic system, by voting them out and replacing them with good politicians. We don't want to battle corruptions like ancient emperors hanging the children of rebels. That's the stance that we propose on the opposition side. 3 things we are going to do in this speech. Firstly, on justifications. Secondly, clarification of the trade-off and exclusiveness of our case. And thirdly, reasons as to why we get better changes on a consequential level. First, on principle justifications. We think firstly, governments are never engaged on the point about how this is against procedural justice, against things like democracy, against things like rule of law on our side of the house. So we already win half of this clash. But secondly, if we talk about the justification of family members themselves, we think we have several things to say, right? Firstly, we rebut their premise that they can always know that their husbands, etc., are corrupt, right? We think a lot of times they don't talk about this kind of thing in the family. They can cover it up. They can like make up some story how this money comes about, or how like their promotions or their good universities come about. So not necessarily that these family members in their they can't necessarily know. We think they give no specific characterizations, especially saying there is asymmetric power structure. That is to say, in a lot of conservative families, husbands do not talk about a lot of serious things with their wives and their children. That is why there are further reasons why they're not likely to know. Secondly, we deny the premise that they always have the alternative to call out. We think that there is no real feasibility, and governments really didn't deal with this case, right? We think firstly, there's a family power structure. Firstly, the men are the bread earners, which means that they have a lot of like
family power of say within the family. So, and secondly, there are stereotypes that women or children are not rational enough and not reasonable enough to talk about serious things regarding with their work. That's how those kind of like politicians in traditional societies are less likely to listen to you in the first place, or do not have the agency to change. And secondly, do not have the alternative to really say reporting and calling out, because for a lot of times, if the bread earner in your family is arrested, firstly, you face a lot of stigmatization. Secondly, right, you lose your financial income, and there are a lot of structural reasons why it is hard for you to find a job. So we think in a lot of cases, it's too hard for those individuals to just say to call out their like the corrupt officials. So we think that since there's no agency, they have no culpability. Now, on the second case, they say they are beneficiaries. We think this depends on agency, but secondly, it is disproportionate, because if they are beneficiaries, then the proportionate punishment should be to take away the benefits they get. But this is not going to happen, because if you put this kind of thing on social media, there's likely to be a lot of public blaming, public shaming, and a lot of people who are like really fat will even turn to the street and harass them. At least you have a lot of personal attacks. This creates great mental trauma, creates mental health. It's when you ruins your social circles. We think this is disproportionate for you simply like inactively receiving this kind of benefits. That's how they don't get justification. Secondly, clarification. What do we get on our side of the house? We think that when we see corrupt officials openly, we push for things like, for example, sending them to a trial, sending them to prison, or we like push for open elections where we can vote them out, get them out of power, right? Why we think that this is something that we want to propose? We see that firstly, this is something that is exclusive, that they cannot get on their side of the house, right? There are 4 reasons for this. A, you have limited political capitals and limited power of propaganda, which means that if you use your social media accounts to call out families of politicians, you have less resources and less visibility towards things like, we want this election to be open, we want this official to be tried in court. Secondly, there's less incentive for institutional reform when people can resort to personal attack to solving corruption. People will think that if some officials are corrupt, they can call their families to solve this kind of problem. There's less incentive to say, let's send them to jail, or like things like, let's get this election more open. Thirdly, right, you have contradictory stances, because if you really want to call out like this kind of politicians personally, then we will have less persuasiveness when we want to argue for things like rule of law, things like human rights protections, and call out things against like extrajudicial punishments, right? Fourthly, you have more risk of being arrested by government, because this is something that government can more weaponize against you to say that you're harassing officials, as compared to calling for things like institutional reform, which is generally considered as legitimate. Before that, at this point, any POIs?
Yeah. So I think that activism itself is already not legal in these contexts, right?
So now, lastly, on comparison, I thought I didn't open my video. Or is there a POI?
Yeah, I have POI.
Okay, yes.
So activism itself is already not legal in these corrupt contexts, right? So we're willing to bite the bullet and go for unjust mechanism, because the injustices that happen by these corrupt politicians are greater than the potential injustice that happen on our mechanism.
Okay, that is our last point. That is to say that even if you want to resort to unjust mechanism to solve the greater injustice, we think you close your door for further pushes for a good society that you want to build, right? There are 3 reasons why you don't get changes on your side of the house. A, we think that you do not solve a lot of problems because a lot of corruptions are invisible, right? These corrupt officials have a lot of mechanisms to hide up their corruption. If you don't get public exposure in the first place, you do not solve corruptions. And in comparison, we think institutional changes have more access from information inside. That's how you get like more exposure. Secondly, we see the discussion on your side of the house is likely to be directed at a person, that you say that people make up a lot of like ways to install those particular individuals, rather than spending their time on politics, trying to think of ways about how to make our institutions better, or pushing for things like reading articles about how democracy works, right? This is how on your side of the house, A, because the discussion is irrational, there will be less scrutiny on the evidences and with wrongful convictions. But B, right, also a lot of politicians can like trigger a lot of public discourse. Even the activists themselves say that you can control the discourse. We think politicians can use this kind of discourse, use this kind of public sentiment that you, for a lot of like call out like individual family members, and they can use this as a tool to weaponize against their opponent politicians. We think this is not the good thing we want to see, right? But C, we think the most important thing is that even if we do not get a lot of positive outcome in terms of like bringing down politicians, at least we get some institutional changes. That is to say that if you have public pressure directed as like sending particular corrupt politicians to court or to jail, or like getting them out in an election, then even if we get less progress than to say more politicians are deterred from corruption on your side of the house, what we get is that we get positive examples where we can bring down politicians in judicial way, we can bring down politicians in democratic ways, right? This gives a positive example to other peoples with the future to say, okay, like in that state, they succeeded in bringing down politicians by election. Then we can also push for this kind of things, right? They have more confidence in the democratic system. You have more support for this kind of solvency in the long term. What is going to happen on their side of the house, that people will resort to this extrajudicial ways of bringing down corruption. They have less incentive to perform institutional changes. That's how you further disenfranchise poor people, because you cannot see the possibility of an open election, of an open judicial system in the near future. That's how like we would propose, even if we only have benefits in the long run, to go for a judicial, a procedurally just way to bring down this kind of politicians. Only the opposition side have told you that A, they have disproportionate justification, and B, they are trading off a good future where you can tackle corruption in institutional way for short-term benefits. Proud to oppose.
All right, so that's the end of the substantive speeches. Now I would like to invite the opposition reply speaker. Here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you're audible, but
Okay.
the visibility part, not really, but it's up to you. And
Okay, don't worry. That's okay.
Yeah.
So my time starts in 3, 2, 1. Panel. In the countries that we talk about in today's debate, social activist is the last hope for future and long-term change. Side opposition gives a unique mechanism on institutional change, and side government's proposal on this so-called actual judicial like blaming and harming those family members uniquely harms the political capital, uniquely discredits the public legitimacy and credibility that those social movements could have, right? 2 issues in my reply speech. First, on principal justification. Second, on solvency, on corruption. First issue to talk about is principal justification, which we think is most important in this debate, right? Firstly, we give you 3 structural reasons on why principally it is unjustified, right? Firstly, we talk about how it's going to harm the innocent. We literally give you 4 structural reasons on why those family members tend to be like innocent, either because of lack of awareness, either because even if they are aware, because of like domestic power disparity, they cannot really change the issue. To this, we hear no satisfactory engagement coming from side of government, right? Second, we also talk about procedural fairness, right? We talk about how social movements, you as a kind of like a movement, needs to obey the democracy, you need to obey the values of the current like legality, right? However, the opposition, the government said, simply say, yeah, but the problem is that there is no functioning and transparent democracy. However, yeah, but that's how evil people do evil things, right? We are not evil people. We are social activists. At least we have some like much more higher principle grounds for us to live up to, right? So we cannot say, eye for an eye, and you like commit evil against evil. That is obey the fundamental principle of social activists. Lastly, talk about proportionality, right? This is exclusively coming from the second speaker and the third speaker of opposition, right? We talk about how it is very disproportionate for you to harm like innocent people who are family members or right? And to trade out for the murky and like very unclear mechanism of how to solve the corruption, right? So we think all of these 3 are independent from any outcomes and is able to for us to win this debate, because this debate motion directly talk about legitimacy, right? It is legitimate for us to simply attack the Gulf case to prove that why they are illegitimate. Second, on solvency of corruption, right? Firstly, the mechanism of government side is this, right? They say we are going to use the trigger the moral incentive, for example, the car sake whatsoever of the family members, and to make them try to persuade and report to the police, and therefore you create a national discord whatsoever. There are several problems of this. Firstly, my panel already talk about how like we are going to like the comparison here is this, right? Under moral incentive, we give you structural responses on economic incentive or financial reliance on those family members. We also talk about the stigmatization that possibly face those family members. Under like sheer comparison, we think our side of the house gives you much more fundamental and much more realistic perception of this incentive structure. Second, we think they talk about like a police system, reporting police. We think that the common ground for this debate already happens in a situation where there's lack of democracy, there's lack effective judicial system. That is why I don't think the so-called reporting police is going to change anything, right? Lastly, I'm going to talk about national discussion. My partner will talk about how it's going to you have a case that is literally against you in front of the court, in front of the social media, because the current media is going to be manipulated by the government, and also you have concrete evidence against the social activists, right? However, on the outside of the house, we are the team that are able to give you structural reasons on why institutional change may happen by trying to appeal the public support, right? However, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the way, right? Their side of the house team tend to claim, if we can solve give you one people unhappiness versus 1,000 people who suddenly miraculously get out of poverty, right? We think firstly, they don't prove the mechanism of how effectively they are going to do this, right? And secondly, we think even if they can do this, it's only a short term, right? Our side of the house give you sustainability, which is much more fundamental, because we give you're going to have less social activists to begin with, because those activists are going to be jailed whatsoever, right? And we also give you institutional changes on future reforms. If we have a social activist that is gradually gaining public support, gradually gaining public credibility, and we think that is the thing that we demand at side opposition. Based on that, we're very proud to oppose.
All right, Gov, reply, please.
Hi, assuming that I'm audible.
Yep, you are.
The stance of opposition side is so confusing, right? Because they initially start the debate by saying that this debate is existing in conservative countries in which the stigmatization happens. Firstly, we are not telling these family members to get divorced or abandon their fathers, right? The message is that you should also try to change and curb the behaviors of your family politician. I'm not sure as to why these context being conservatives really is important, right? But secondly, power imbalance exists here and there, right? Even within a political party, discrepancy between president and vice president exists doesn't mean that we don't criticize vice president, right? So I don't really see as to why this idea of this power imbalance, entire conservatism that they talk about, is really an important issue anyways, right? But at the same breath, they are also saying that already rule of law is there to ensure effective activism. What is the context that you want to talk about, right? Because if the context is where corruption is super rampant, where lack of media scrutiny, etc., activism itself is already not legal to begin with, right? We already have seen how Putin literally trying to kill Navalny, and that was justified in that regime, right? So we're willing to bite the bullet and go for presumably an unjust mechanism if precisely because of the fact that the harm that caused by these corrupt politicians and their family is greater in terms of the magnitude and the severity. And this is the meta and utilitarian calculation that the governments brought you in this debate, which was dismissed by opposition. But if we're talking about the context in which the judicial justice is already happening, this means that things like freedom of speech is being legally guaranteed, right? Which means that calling out is seen as justified mechanism. So I'm not sure as to why, if all other legal mechanisms are there that opposition side really wants to proclaim, why this mechanism is automatically unjustified, right? The question is, are these people is it justified in which we criticize these individuals? We told you a lot of mechanisms that were dismissed by opposition. Firstly, we told you that you could have done something, but you chose not to do right? And I think therefore these family members are not innocent as opposition side asserts, right? Especially in contexts in which the corruptions are quite vivid. Families also know that they themselves are the beneficiaries of the political inequalities, right? So often, especially in contexts where corruption is rampant, it is something that families are able to know, often in the idea of them trying to defend by saying, I didn't know that corruption was existing, is simply an excuse, and therefore we would say that you are guilty by omission and guilty by inaction. But secondly, we told you that you are also the beneficiary of the corruption, even if you're unconscious, which we think that opposition side also concede in this debate. But we also proved to you why checks and balances for this strategy exist for this to be proportionate, right? Because if family members are already doing supporting activism, then this means that incentive for activists to not criticize these people exists precisely because they're already an ally, right? So it's fair for us to say that the strategy applies in context in which these family members are involved in that like corruption, right? But also in terms of the efficacy, which was largely unresponded to by the opposition. We told you that number one, families in status quo are brushing off the corruption problem under the carpet despite their patronage benefits that they accrued, right? Therefore, on our side, we curb their mentality and tell them that A, you are complicit of the corruption, or at least you're complacent, right? But B, you should also you should and you can change the status of corruption by your effort and using your tie with that politician as a family member, right? But secondly, I think that we also talked about how there's a less entry barrier existing on our side, which means that we get political mass, and the critical mass is key to gain the sustainability of the movement. They didn't prove as to why people will support their movement on their side of the bench, right? We told you that it's easier to criticize Putin's children rather than Putin himself, right? But they say, but they are also seen as elites in these societies, precisely since we are able to tear down those privileged by saying that these people are in fact not very smart or intelligent, but these people were able to enter the university because of their elite, all these patronage, nepotism, is exactly how we're able to view them as some people who are criticizable, right? I think that is a reason why more people have an impetus and catharsis to opt into the movement, and this is how we gain political mass, right? For all these reasons, HUFS, not HUFS, is so proud to take EFL champion. Thanks.
All right, thank you to both teams for what was an excellent debate. All the best for the results later. And I think this is the part where I ask